Well, this morning we are going to continue where we left off last week in our study of Jesus' Olivet Discourse here in Mark 13. Now, in case you weren't here last week, or you're just visiting this morning, or perhaps you just need a quick catching up to speed, let me remind you before we jump back into verse 14, kind of remind you where we are and where we've come. You remember when introducing Mark 13, I told you this was Jesus' longest recorded teaching in the Gospel of Mark, and I think it's also probably the most difficult to interpret and to understand. There's a variety of opinions, there's a variety of interpretations about this chapter, but really the major debate centers around this question. Were the prophecies that Jesus gives here in Mark 13, have they already been fulfilled, that being in AD 70, in the destruction of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem, or are these prophecies yet to be fulfilled in the return of Jesus? And in ripping the Band-Aid off last week, as I told you, I just said, let's rip it off, let me tell you where I'm coming from, and then we'll jump into it. I personally believe, let me quote again what I told you last week, that this passage is not pointing to the future return of Jesus in his second coming, but instead was a prophecy about the destruction of the temple in AD 70 and thus has already been fulfilled. Now, if you remember, I gave you two major considerations that lead me to such a conclusion. The first is the context of the verses, and the second is the understanding of generation there in verse 30. The first, the context is clear in the first few verses that Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple. The disciples and Jesus, they make their way out of the temple. One of the disciples notes how wonderful, how grand, how large these buildings are, and immediately in response to that, Jesus offers this prophetic announcement in verse 2. There will not be left one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Now, obviously, in response to that assertion by Jesus, the disciples had questions, and so they asked Jesus for signs that they should expect for this day coming. And so verse 5 onward was Jesus' answer to that question. The second thing that leads me to this conclusion is really what I consider to be the linchpin of this passage, and that is verse 30. Verse 30, Jesus says there, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." And the question for us is, who is he referring to? Now, I argued last week the normal and the consistent usage by Jesus of this Greek word that Jesus uses here, translated in our English translations as generation, is to mean that very thing, this generation. A period typically in the Jewish mind of 30 to 40 years. In fact, in all of the 43 times that this word is used in the New Testament, in every single time it means generation. And so I believe Jesus was telling them, in your lifetime, in the lifetime of those hearing my voice right now, everything that I've just spelled out from verses 5 through 29 would happen. And you would see that happening in God's judgment poured out upon Jerusalem, culminating in that destruction of the temple that they were just marveling. Now, I realize, as I said last week, I'll say again, I realize this is the minority position within evangelicalism today. And if you were not here last week and you're saying, what in the world is he talking about? I have no clue what he's saying. I'd encourage you to go back and listen to the sermon from last week. I unpack all of that much more clearly, I hope. But that catches you up to speed. We then looked at the first 6 signs last week that Jesus told them to expect. They're there on your outline. He tells them to look for the appearance of religious impostors and messianic pretenders, to look for military conflict, political upheaval, natural disasters, religious persecution, intense personal hatred, and the widespread preaching of the gospel. And with each of those, I showed you how I believe those were fulfilled in the immediate decades following Jesus' teaching here. And as I said, I think those 6 things are pretty easy for us to swallow. They're pretty easy for us to understand. Okay, I get that happened there in the first few centuries. Well, this morning we are going to continue to the second half, and we're going to come to some things that I think are a bit more difficult, perhaps, for you to accept on the surface that they have already been fulfilled. But that is my goal this morning, to walk from verses 14 through verse 31, the same as we did last week, and show what I think Jesus was pointing his disciples and his hearers to, and how those things actually have been fulfilled in that generation to whom Jesus spoke. So let's jump right in to our passage. Let me read it for us. I'm not going to read verses 1 through 13 again. I trust that you have read those and will remember those. But let's jump right into verse 14, and let me read down through verse 31. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down, nor enter his house to take anything out, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it may not happen in winter. For in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now, and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on guard. I have told you all things beforehand. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So let's jump right in here this morning to our passage and continue with these signs that Jesus points us to. Here in verse 14, really the longest passage here in the chapter, verse 14 down through verse 23, we have Jesus describing here what he calls a great tribulation. And this time of great tribulation is comprised of several elements. The first of those things here is identified as the abomination of desolation. Look again with me at verse 14 and what Jesus says. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to stand, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Literally this phrase, abomination of desolation, means the abomination that causes desolation. Jesus is referring here, I believe, to a prophecy that was given by the prophet Daniel, to the prophet Daniel by the archangel Gabriel there in Daniel 9. In fact, throughout Daniel, chapters 8, 9, 11, 12, we see this word abomination being used to refer to an object of disgust or hatred, something that causes revulsion, an idolatrous affront to the true worship of God. And so when Jesus says here, refers to this abomination of desolation, there's many scholarly opinions as to the precise meaning about what this is or who this is, but there's pretty much universal agreement that it refers to some sort of pagan desecration of the temple. Some believe that this prophecy was at least partially fulfilled in the 2nd century BC with the sacrilege that was committed by Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes there in the 2nd century BC conquers Jerusalem. He goes into the Holy of Holies and sacrifices a pig on a pagan altar within the very holy holies of the temple. But it appears here that Jesus envisions that a repeat performance in his day would happen similar to what happened under Antiochus. Now, there's several opinions as to and theories as to how this prophecy might have been fulfilled, but the most likely seems to be that this was fulfilled in Titus and the armies of Rome. You see, as Jerusalem was still burning, the Roman soldiers there bring in their legionary standards into the temple precincts. They offer sacrifices there, and they declare within the Holy of Holies Titus to be the victor. Now, if you know anything about these tensions that have been happening between the Jews and between Rome, this idolatrous representation of Caesar and the Roman eagle within their very temple would have constituted the worst imaginable blasphemy for the Jewish people. I believe that it seems that in Titus and in his army's actions, we have a parallel performance, a repeat action of what was done by Antiochus, and that indeed is what Jesus was referring to here when he says, when you see that, when you see the abomination that causes desolation, standing where he ought not to stand, he says then, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. This points us to the second thing that Jesus points us to here in this time of tribulation, which is a plan of escape. He says, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now listen, this would have been completely contrary advice to all contemporary wisdom and advice in the midst of such a siege and such a tribulation within ancient times. Jesus continues. He says, let the one who is on the housetop don't go down nor enter his house to take anything out. Let the one who's in the field not turn back to take his cloak. You see, in times of invasion in this time, people did not flee to the mountains. Where did they flee instead? They fled to the walled cities. They fled to the compound, as it were, which was universally regarded as the safest place for them. What's interesting about this, though, is that when the Romans invaded and placed Jerusalem under siege, Jerusalem was packed with people from the countryside and the villages. In fact, when the city finally fell, over 1.1 million Jews were slaughtered by the Romans. But you know who was not part of those who were slaughtered within the temple walls? The Christians. Why? Because they listened to Jesus here. They listened to Jesus' warning to flee to the mountains. They heeded his warning, and they were spared the slaughter that followed. Jesus is teaching his followers here, look out for that sign. Look out for that sign. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to stand, you better get out of there quickly because the end is coming soon. Don't go back and grab stuff. Don't turn around in case you forgot something. Get out and get out quickly. He then gives us this note here in verses 17 and 18 about pregnant women and the difficulties of that when he says, alas for women who are pregnant, those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that it may not happen in winter. All of these are just Jesus' practical helps and advice to his people. When you see these signs coming, you ask for signs. You've asked what the signs are going to be that the temple's destroyed. When you see these things happening, flee quickly to the mountains. These were going to be difficult and trying days. In fact, I don't even think difficult and trying are words that adequately describe what the people were about to face. These were going to be days unlike they had ever endured in their life. And Jesus says as much. Look what he says in verse 19. In those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of creation that God created until now and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. Now, since not many of us here this morning are ancient historians, I thought it might be wise and helpful at this point to summarize a bit for you in case you're not fully aware of what exactly happened in AD 70, really AD 66 to AD 70. What happened when the Romans invaded Jerusalem in order to get a better picture of the horror that actually took place and how these verses might have been fulfilled. That leads us here to our next point, which is the horror of AD 70. Now, the best historical information that we have about what happened during these times comes from a Jewish author and historian named Josephus. Josephus wrote a first-hand, comprehensive, eyewitness account of these events, of the Jewish revolt in 66 to 70 and the subsequent falling of the city in AD 70. Now, there was a war that broke out in AD 66 between the Romans and the Jews. This was really just an intensification of a continued conflict that had been brewing between these two for years and years, decades and decades. And Jerusalem then was the last of the Jewish stronghold. It was the last stronghold for the Jews, and as such, it became the focus of Rome's most brutal rage as the war came to a head. You see, in this time of Jerusalem, you had multiple groups had gathered together and had fled the countryside, fled the surrounding cities to come to Jerusalem. You had thieves, you had zealots, you had murderers. All of them had flocked to the city walls of Jerusalem to seek refuge. And as such, the city was completely without law and order. Chaos and anarchy reigned in that day. We fast forward to AD 70, to the year 70, and it is the Passover season. And in the Passover season, there was a momentary lull in hostilities between the Romans and the Jews. And as such, it led to the city's gates being thrown wide open to receive and accept all who would want to come, who desired to observe the Passover feast in Jerusalem. The population of the city swelled because of that, and that ended up contributing to the tremendous slaughter that was about to take place. You see, the Roman general Vespasian, he was called upon because Nero had died, and he was soon himself to be named emperor. Well, his son Titus was the one that assumed responsibility for the battle against the Jews. And Titus had repeatedly offered clemency to the Jews if they would just surrender the city, surrender themselves, but they would not surrender in the slightest. And so the Romans encircled the city of Jerusalem as all these people were there, and famine soon sets in. Listen to what Josephus says when he writes this. The madness of the seditious did also increase together with their famine, and both those miseries were every day inflamed more and more. For there was no corn which anywhere appeared publicly. It was now a miserable case and a sight that would justly bring tears to our eyes, insomuch that children pulled the very morsels that their fathers were eating out of their very mouth. So did the mothers to their infants. You see, things were absolutely awful in the city walls of Jerusalem. People not only sold their homes trying to get food, but they also ended up selling their children, trying to obtain some sort of nourishment for themselves. People regularly ate from the public sewers. They ate cattle and pigeon dung. They ate leather shields, hay, clothing, and they ended up even eating things that the scavenger dogs wouldn't even touch. As if he was commenting from verse 19 of what Jesus says in verse 19, listen to again to what Josephus writes concerning that horror of this tribulation. He writes, "It is therefore impossible to go distinctly over every instance of these men's iniquity. I shall therefore speak my mind here at once briefly, that neither did any other city suffer such miseries, nor did any other age ever breed a generation more fruitful in wickedness than this was, from the beginning of the world." In desperation, some of these Jews would leave the city walls at night to try to hunt for food. They'd be captured by the Romans. You had thousands crucified in plain sight of the city walls, often at over 500 per day. And so many were killed in this manner that Josephus says that room was wanting for crosses, and crosses were wanting for the bodies. You had the Romans trying to siege and trying to capture the city several times with no success, until finally Titus orders his troops to actually build a wall around the Jerusalem walls themselves to cut off any remaining avenue of escape. And this, as you can imagine, only served to intensify the famine and the horror that they faced. Josephus actually tells of one woman who kills her son, roasts his body, and eats half of him, only to hide the remaining half until other people begin to smell the stench and want the food that she has. It was an awful, terrible time. Not only do we read of these historical accounts of the horror taking place in this tribulation, but just as Jesus goes on to mention, verse 21, 22, that false messiahs, false Christ would come up, Josephus again says the same thing. This happened over and over. False prophets misled the people and contributed to their demise. All of this took place until finally the Romans finally penetrated the heart of the city, and the slaughter continued until the soldiers were, quote, grew weary of killing. Listen one more time to what Josephus writes about those Roman soldiers. When they went in numbers into the lanes of the city with their swords drawn, They slew those whom they overtook without mercy and set fire to the houses where the Jews had fled and burnt every soul in them and laid waste a great many of the rest. And when they were come to the houses to plunder them, they found in them entire families of dead men and the upper rooms full of dead corpses, that is, of such as died by the famine. They then stood in horror at this sight and went out without touching anything. But although they had this commiseration for such as were destroyed in that manner, yet had they not the same for those who were still alive. But they ran every one through whom they met with, and obstructed the very lanes with their dead bodies, and made the whole city run down with blood to such a degree that the fire of many of the houses was quenched with the blood of men. Yet over 1.1 million Jews die in the siege of this city. Almost 100,000 Jewish survivors were then sold into slavery. Others were consigned to die in gladiatorial games and so forth. And after just completely ravaging the city, ravishing all of its inhabitants, orders were then given to destroy and demolish the entire city and the temple itself, with reports that not only did they destroy the temple to the ground, but they also then dug up its very foundations, so that nothing was left of it whatsoever. Now, all of this is, I think, important historical information for us to understand if we are going to get a sense of the reality of Jesus' words here when he tells them to flee to the mountains because a tribulation is going to come to the city such as has never been seen and will never see again. Now, the biggest pushback to the position that I am advocating, that this prophecy was in fact fulfilled in AD 70, is that Jesus says here that this tribulation would be one that has not been from the beginning of creation that God created and never will be. Now, many will insist that this great tribulation referred to by Jesus could not have referred to the events in AD 70 because worse and more severe tribulations would have followed for the Jewish people. World War II and the Holocaust, Stalin, just to name a couple. Now, I think it's possible for us to take Jesus' words here either literally or hyperbolically, and either way you take them, I think we still see it fit with an AD 70 fulfillment. First, if you take his words literally, once you grasp the realities, the savagery, the cruelty, the horror that took place here within the temple walls, it's not hard for us to imagine that this was the worst tribulation that the Jews had faced up until that point. And when it comes to comparing to other horrors that have happened since, it's worth noting that never in the history of the Jews has so high a percentage of one city's population been destroyed as was destroyed in Jerusalem in AD 70. So if you take his words literally here, I think it's possible to still see this as an AD 70 fulfillment. But it very well may be that Jesus' statement here is deliberately hyperbolic, a saying that was used for an indescribably horrendous time. Not meant to say literally that there would never be a time where we would ever see a tribulation come to that point in the future. Let me just share with you a few texts from the Old Testament that have linguistic parallels to what Jesus says here. Exodus 11, verse 6, concerning the death of the firstborn in Egypt. There shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there has never been nor will ever be again. Exodus 9:18. Behold, about this time tomorrow I will cause a very heavy hail to fall, such as never been in Egypt from the day until it was found until now. Joel 2:2 is another one. Ezekiel 5:9, another. All of these prophetic language, using this language simply to refer to an incredibly horrendous time. I think it's very important to consider these two passages, 2 Kings 18:5 and 2 Kings 23:25. You have similar language, not about cataclysmic events, but about kings of the people. But listen to the language used, 2 Kings 18:5. He, Hezekiah in this instance, trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that there was not like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor among those who were before him. So you have this language. There's never going to be a better king before or after 2 Kings 18:5 about Hezekiah. 5 chapters later, 2 Kings 23, verse 25, this time speaking of Josiah, before him, Josiah, there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might according to the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. Now, if we take those literally, those contradict each other. Because 2 Kings 18:5 says there's never going to be a king as good as Hezekiah. 2 Kings 23:25, there's never been a king as good as Josiah. You see, this was language often employed in the Old Testament simply to refer to this hyperbolic sort of language. It's possible, therefore, that Jesus then was employing this sort of language of Old Testament writers simply to say, this is going to be a time of intense horror, intense calamity, intense horrific judgment. So, again, I believe that what Jesus says here concerning this tribulation, we see historically fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. Now, quickly, verse 23, he ends this section by telling them, but be on guard, I have told you all things beforehand. In other words, Jesus is telling them, listen, you've now been informed. You know what to watch for. Don't forget my words. Take them to heart. Keep watch. When you see these things coming, be ready. The judgment is coming. Now, what follows then in verses 24 to 27, this final sign that Jesus points to, is perhaps the most difficult for many to understand how this sign could have been fulfilled in AD 70 and could be referring to anything other than the final return of Christ. So verse 24 through 27, we see the final sign that Jesus tells his disciples to look out for, and that is the coming of the Son of Man in clouds with great power and glory. Look again with me at verses 24 through 27. Jesus says, but in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the heaven to the ends of the earth. Now, what is Jesus talking about here? Now, on the surface, I admit it seems to us, in our 21st century years, it seems that he is talking about his second coming, doesn't it? And I think this view is strengthened by the fact that the language here that Jesus uses is similar to other New Testament passages that are universally taken to refer to his second coming. 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 16 and 17, as an example. Now listen, I admit to you, this passage and these three verses are the biggest struggle for me in this chapter. It is the only passage in this chapter that originally caused me to press the pause button a little bit before I fully took this chapter as referring to things that had already been fulfilled. And for many of you this morning, this passage not only causes you to press the pause button, it causes you to press the reject button, right? That view can't be right, because this is referring to Jesus' second coming. Well, let me tell you a few ways that people have dealt with these verses and the surrounding context. One is the one I mentioned last week. You have this statement there in verse 30, that this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So the first way that people deal with not only this passage, but the whole chapter, is to say that Jesus means something different by the word generation than what he would normally mean, what every other instance in the New Testament means of generation. And he means something more along the lines of this race, or this category of people will not pass away. And as such, this chapter is not referring to past events, it's referring to future events. So just to reiterate, I just don't think this is a viable option for us. If we are going to correctly understand linguistics, normal uses of words, I just don't think that this is an option for us, in my opinion. The second way that people have dealt with verses 24 through 27, and really the whole chapter, is what has been known as full preterism. And this position would say that Jesus was, in fact, talking here in verse 24 to 27 about his second coming, and that he actually did return in AD 70. And there's nothing for us to look forward to. Jesus has returned. His second coming, his parousia, has already happened. The resurrection has already happened, so on and so forth. Listen, this is a position that has been historically been declared to be out of bounds with Christian orthodoxy, and it's not even on the table for us to consider this morning. Jesus has not returned, and we are awaiting his return in the future. Now, the third way, perhaps some of you have taken this route. The third way that people deal with this is by using Matthew's version, his parallel version of the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, to help us interpret Mark. if you want to turn to Matthew 24, you can look with me at verse 3. The basis of this position really centers around the disciples' question and the slight difference that Matthew has when recounting the disciples' question versus Mark. Now remember, Mark's version, verse 4, the disciples ask this. Listen to the question. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? Straightforward question. Now listen to how Matthew phrases it and note the slight change. Tell us, verse 3, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So some will say, in Matthew's account, the disciples are really asking two different questions. When will the temple be destroyed, and what will be the sign of that? And what will be the sign of your second coming, Jesus? And so they would say, as we look through the rest of the Olivet Discourse, we could divide it up. The first section is prophecy pointing to the destruction of the temple. And the second half, including these verses here about the coming on clouds with great power and glory, refers to his second coming and his return. Listen, I admit, when I heard this position, I liked it. It certainly clears up some difficulties, right? You've got a very clear divide. It makes it very clear to understand. But I think this position has a fatal flaw. Just like in Mark, all of these signs, the easier to understand ones like the wars coming and famines and earthquakes, all of those, and the abomination of desolation, the great tribulation, and even the coming of the Son of Man on clouds with power, all of these signs are given by Jesus before his statement in verse 34 of Matthew 24, when he says there again, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Listen, if that verse was inserted above the passage about his return, I'd adopt it immediately. We'd have a great, clear-cut argument. I think it's a great position. But as it is, the same difficulty is faced in Matthew's version as it is in Mark's. Really, the crux of the issue, when we boil it all down, has to do with how we understand verse 30 of Mark. How we understand the statement about this generation not passing away until all these things take place. Now, for me, and I think all of us would agree, I think it's a wise biblical hermeneutic to always have us take what is clear and help us interpret what is unclear. We take the clear in Scripture and use that to help us interpret the unclear. Now, I'm sure some of you may disagree, but for me, what is clear in Mark 13, what is clear in the Olivet Discourse, is both the context of Jesus' prophecy concerning the temple and the meaning of his statement in verse 30 that this generation will not pass away until these signs are fulfilled. That's the clear. I then use that to help me interpret what is unclear. And then I have to ask myself this question, well, how might verses 24 through 27 actually have been fulfilled in AD 70? Is it possible that the language of these verses means something different than the second coming of Christ and are actually instead apocalyptic language being used to refer to the coming judgment upon Jerusalem and upon the temple? I believe the answer to that is yes. Let me quickly walk you through each of these statements and show you how I think we can understand those. The first is to note his language here at the beginning. He says, after that tribulation, and then we have this language, this apocalyptic language. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in earth will be shaken. I think the first thing for us to note is that this language that Jesus uses here was language that was characteristically used by the Old Testament prophets consistently to warn of the coming judgment of God. Let me just give you one example, Isaiah 13, verses 6 through 10. This was a passage that was part of a proclamation of the judgment on Babylon by Isaiah. And it's typical here of Old Testament prophecies of doom. Listen to what Isaiah says in chapter 13, and notice in the last couple verses the similarities to Jesus' language. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near, Isaiah says. As destruction from the Almighty it will come. Therefore all hands will be feeble and every human heart will melt. They will all be dismayed. Pangs and agony will seize them. They will be in anguish like a woman in labor. They will look aghast at one another. Their faces will be aflame. Now listen, here comes the similar language. Verse 9. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation and destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. Notice that similar language there. You can see the same thing in Ezekiel 32, used to describe the impending judgment on Egypt. Isaiah 34, used to describe the impending judgment on Edom. I think we have to remember here that when Jesus is teaching this section, he's speaking to a people, he's speaking to his disciples that were saturated with Old Testament language, saturated with Old Testament concepts and imagery. From the earliest days of their lives, they would have memorized the Old Testament. And so when Jesus uses this language here, I think that he's using vocabulary that instantly would have been recognized to their minds to refer to the judgment of God that was about to be poured out. Listen to how one commentator puts it. He says, when Israel was judged, or when Babylon was subdued by the Medes, or when Idumea and Egypt were destroyed, it was not the literal sun, moon, and stars that were darkened. The literal stars of heaven did not fall from the skies, and the literal constellations were not dissolved or rolled up as a scroll. These figurative expressions were clearly presented in a purely symbolic manner to characterize the destruction befalling nations and earthly powers. The first thing we understand, verse 24, I think it's very clear to understand that simply in terms of Old Testament prophetic imagery. The second thing we must deal with there is in verse 26. When Jesus says here, they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Now, many Christians, I think, have automatically assumed that Jesus is speaking here of his second coming, and there's no other option for what these words are referring to. I think it's important for us to understand, though, that nowhere in this passage does Jesus use the term parousia, which is the term used throughout the New Testament to refer to his return. Instead, what we have here in verse 26, when we read that we will see the Son of Man coming, what we have here instead is the Greek word erchomai, which can be either translated coming or going. In fact, in 50 of its occurrences in the New Testament, the word is translated as he is going or he went. Now, there's a couple ways we could take this passage as being fulfilled, as having already been fulfilled. One would be to see verse 26 to be describing a spiritual coming of Jesus. Jesus coming in the terms of a spiritual sense and an act of judgment upon the false religion of the Jews in the temple. I think that's possible. There's many who take it that way. I think another option, perhaps more convincing to me, is to understand that here in Mark 13, the coming of the Son of Man may very well be an allusion to Daniel 7, verses 13 to 14, which speaks not of a coming to earth from heaven, like we understand Jesus returning, but of a going or a coming to God in heaven to receive vindication and authority. Understood this way then, this coming would then refer to an event whereby the authority of Jesus is vindicated over the Jewish establishment which has rejected him. Listen to this text from Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 to 14. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Daniel's vision here clearly is not about a descent from heaven to earth, right? We agree on that. It's not about a second coming of the Son of Man at the close of history. Rather, it's a vision of the Son of Man coming to heaven before the Ancient of Days to God the Father to receive his kingdom. As such, if we understand Jesus' language here in verse 26 to be a fulfillment of this sort of Daniel 7 prophecy, we would understand Mark 13:26 to be a passage not about the return of Christ at the end of history, but a passage about his enthronement as King of Kings and Lord of Lords in the very middle of history, the very thing that Paul points us to in Philippians chapter 2. very quickly, and we may come back to some of these next week because I don't want to leave them hanging for you if you have more questions. But very quickly, how do we understand and make sense then of verse 27? He says here, and he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the heaven to the ends of the earth. Again, many believers understand this to refer to the second coming of Christ and the ingathering of believers as we have it pictured in 1 Thessalonians 4. But I think we could also understand this differently. The Greek word translated here as angel, here angelos, literally means messenger. So it's also possible that what Jesus is speaking of here is the gospel going forth by human messengers who would be God's instruments to gather in his elect following the fall of Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. This gathering together of God's elect then would not be a reference to the end times harvest, but would be a reference to the global growth of the church that is ongoing even in this present age. I think as we understand it this way, what Jesus is saying is that in those days after that tribulation, you are going to see cataclysmic events happen in such a way, in the destruction of Jerusalem, in the destruction of the temple. You're going to see these things happen that are going to rock and shake everything that you have ever known. And when you see that happening, that is a sign, and that points you, verse 26, that the Son of Man is coming in clouds with great power and glory. Not coming from heaven to earth, but those are symbolic fulfillments of the Son of Man coming to God the Father and receiving all of the kingdoms on earth under his feet as the authoritative King of kings and Lord of lords that he is. And when that happens, verse 27, his people, his messengers are sent out from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. Language that's characteristically used throughout the Bible to refer not literally from to earth to heaven, but simply from pole to pole, from extreme to extreme. His messengers are going to be sent out to gather in his elect until he returns. Now listen, I know that is a lot. I know this is a complicated, complex, and long debated passage. But what I want to submit to you as we come to a close in this section of Mark 13 is that when we read this chapter contextually, I don't think it has to be as complicated and complex as we often try to make it be. I think if we understand the context, if we understand Jesus' promise, and we understand some of the poetic, apocalyptic, and hyperbolic language often used by Jesus and used here in this chapter, then what we see is Jesus pointing his disciples to signs to look for in the first century that would point them surely to the impending judgment upon Jerusalem, the impending destruction of the temple, and that the tribulation that would ensue along with that judgment and these earthly developments, that in all of this they would see the spiritual authority taken from those powers to be and given to Jesus Christ, who now sits at the right hand of the Father, ruling and reigning supreme, and who sends us out as his messengers to gather in his elect from the corners of the earth until his return. Now again, you may completely disagree with my interpretation of this chapter, and you're just, God, I'm glad this is over. Can't wait till we move to Mark chapter 14. If that is you, that's okay. That's perfectly okay. Listen, I trust that all of us gathered in this room this morning, that we are, as followers of Christ, coming to God's word as his truthful and inerrant and sufficient word that it is, and we're seeking to interpret and understand it as best as we're able. And sometimes on these matters of non-essentials, like we talked about last week, we come to different conclusions, and that is okay. But listen, the beauty of the gospel is this, and the beauty of the local church is this, that we are not saved according to our eschatology. Right? We are not saved by whether or not we believe this to be fulfilled prophecy or yet to be fulfilled prophecy. We are saved by grace alone in Christ alone. And we are not even, this is the beauty of the local church, we are not even united together as brothers and sisters in Christ according to our eschatology. And I say this because there are missions organizations today, there are churches today about which that statement could not be said. They are united or disunited over their interpretations of eschatology. But I believe we are not united over our understanding of eschatology. We are united together by the blood of Christ and by his Spirit poured out upon us. And so this morning, agreeing or disagreeing with me over eschatology, agreeing or disagreeing over whether or not this passage has been fulfilled or is yet to be fulfilled, listen, we have the privilege now this morning to declare our unity together as brothers and sisters in Christ by partaking one with another of these elements in the Lord's Supper this morning that are a visible picture to us of the gospel and a visible picture to us of our being united together even in the midst of differences on secondary and tertiary matters. Lord willing, we'll come back to this chapter next week, look verse 32 through the end, and see Jesus' command for us to be ready. But let's go to the Lord in prayer now. Let's pray that our hearts and our minds would be prepared to come to this table, and that we would, in fact, be united, not only to the Lord, but to one another as we receive these elements. Let's pray together.